If we can get the majority leader to quit kibitzing. Here he comes. Thank you for coming up. Okay. I can't resist doing this, and that is, I'm a practicing lawyer, and usually we appear before judges and we're afraid of being held in contempt. So when you get to introduce a judge and she's a former judge, you can do all kinds of things. But I'm going to be very careful. Amy Dean is a retired judge from Florida, and she's here to prove that Judge Larry is not typical of the judges in Florida. Amy Dean is a qualified judge. Currently, she's doing arbitration and mediation, and she's a great member of NJDC, and we've asked her to introduce Leader Hoyer.
He got the contract, though. That's what I don't get. Silent. My grandmother had this term as I was growing up. Thanks. And it was good to neshama. It means a good soul, a good spirit. And I think this pretty much sums up our speaker tonight. My path first crossed with Congressman Hoyer in the mid-'80s when I traveled with a group of members of the board from the United Jewish Appeal to Helsinki to observe the hearings that were taking place by the Helsinki Commission regarding Soviet Jewry. And Congressman Hoyer, he was the chair of the commission, and we left to a person knowing that this man was totally committed to improving the lot of our brothers and sisters in the Soviet Union, and he was an ardent advocate for their freedom. I sort of dropped out of the radar because I was on the bench for about 12 years. And when I resurfaced, I was chair of our JCRC, which is our Jewish Community Relations Council. This is now 2003. And a group of us went to Washington to try to get more support and help for needs in our local communities for the elderly, for children, and for the disabled. We met with our elected officials from our respective states, and in the afternoon, weary, we then met with Congressman Hoyer, who spoke to us and pledged his support, but more than that, he exhorted us to get out there and do more and whatever we could to help those who were in need. Because for Congressman Hoyer, if you woke him up at 3 o'clock in the morning from a dead sleep, his visceral response would be, what can we do to help? He said recently to the Washington Post that his goal in life was to, in fact, make a difference on the things that matter to him. So let's see, we've got Americans with disabilities, education, voting, wages, benefits, you name it, Congressman Hoyer has been there. Last fall, thank goodness, he was elected our majority leader, and I can't think of anyone who is better qualified for the job. He's a consensus builder, and he is certainly the private man that I've gotten to know over the years because he's come to visit with me and my husband since 2003 in Miami a number of times. The private man is as wonderful and delightful as the public man that we all get to see. So please join me in welcoming a good neshama, Congressman Steny Hoyer.
I love you too.
I love you.
Thank you very much. Please be seated. Thanks a lot. I am very, very pleased to be here. I'm glad I got here. We were voting pretty late, and then we have a little supplemental coming up tomorrow. I'll talk to you a little bit about that we're working on. But I am extraordinarily pleased to be here. Ira Foreman has been a friend of mine for longer than he probably wants me to say, and so many of you in this room have been friends of mine for almost all my career. Leonard Blundis at the back, former delegate, only at the back in terms of one of the back tables, who was a member of the House of Delegates when I was in the State Senate. He and I served together, and I've known him in the Young Democrats and for many, many years. The National Jewish Democratic Council is an extraordinarily important organization that I think sends a message that I've talked about before when Ira and the council were kind enough to give me the Henry Scoop Jackson Award. Very important organization, particularly now when I think that the Jewish community in our country that does so much for our country needs to be reassured by those of us who are Democrats of the reasons why they are Democrats. Sometimes they may have that fade from their memory as to exactly why they were Democrats and why they need to continue to be Democrats in terms of the values. But I'm so pleased to be here with you because you have always done that. And so many of you in this room, Amy, thank you for that generous introduction, really were mentors and teachers of mine when I came to Congress in 1981. And then in 1985, when I became chairman of the Helsinki Commission, the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which I had not been a member of before that. Tip O'Neill, talking to Donnie Fasell. Donnie Fasell was a good friend of mine, and he suggested me as the chair of the commission on my first day on the commission. So, but I was very, very focused on the mission of the commission. Those of you who know something about the Helsinki Final Act knows that it has a preamble, principles, and 3 baskets or 3 sections. One deals with security, one deals with economic relations and environmental relations. And the 3rd basket, which was in fact the focus of the Helsinki Commission, deals with human rights and humanitarian concerns. And it was that issue that the Helsinki Commission of the United States uniquely focused on. And in that capacity, as Amy pointed out, I had the great privilege of traveling to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, to Kiev, that was in the Soviet Union at that point in time, as well as a number of countries in the behind the Iron Curtain, the captive nations. I remember once at a meeting in Prague, and Václav Havel was arrested on his way to the meeting with us. It was a breakfast meeting. He was arrested and incarcerated. But I will look back on my congressional career, not soon. Not soon. And I will say that 2 of the efforts in which I was involved that are most meaningful to me as a member of Congress was my participation in the Helsinki Commission, working with refuseniks, working with those in the Soviet Union. I can remember meeting with Natan Sharansky. I remember meeting with Dr. Sakharov and Elena Bonner in their apartment and having dinner and thinking to myself how privileged I was to be given the opportunity by the United States Congress and by the people that I represent to participate in this activity. It did not have much political resonance in my district in a specific sense, but it had great resonance with me. The Americans with Disabilities Act, I think, Amy, is the other effort in which I've been involved that was particularly meaningful for me because of the impact it had on people's lives. But I want to thank all of you so very much for giving me that opportunity. I then want to mention some of my colleagues who are here. Steve Cohen, I see, is here. Steve, newly elected member, doing a wonderful job, very active. Steve Cohen. Steve is from Memphis, Tennessee, was an outstanding member of the State Senate, now an outstanding member of the Congress of the United States. He is a wonderful advocate, and we're very pleased to have him in the Congress of the United States. Next, one of the brightest members of the Congress of the United States, I say one of the brightest because Barney Frank is in the Congress of the United States, so none of us want to be necessarily. But one of the brightest members, most conscientious members, a very close friend of mine. I was born in New York City, as some of you know, so I have a particular fondness for my hometown. I lived in Greenwich Village until I was 9 years of age. And he is a wonderful, wonderful member of Congress. There is nobody in the Congress of the United States more focused on individual liberties and civil liberties and who understands both constitutional applications of our statutes and the values that the Constitution stands for more than this gentleman from New York, and we are advantaged. My district is advantaged by having him as a member of Congress. Jerry Nadler. Jerry. Now, I know there are two, and I know there's a third. I don't know whether there's a fourth in the room if I've missed somebody. But I want to say something about this last lady. I'm in love with this lady, and I say so unabashedly. She has a wonderful husband, wonderful children, but she's between two of my daughters in age. That's how old I'm getting. She is one of the most wonderful representatives in the Congress of the United States, one of the most energetic, focused, effective representatives in the Congress of the United States. I said I lived in Greenwich Village until I was 9 years of age. I lived in South Florida. My stepfather was at Homestead Air Force Base. Elaine Bloom, who should be in Congress, I should be introducing her as a member of Congress. Ron Klein. Oh, Ron is here. Ron was saying, not at the same time, I'm sorry. Let me tell you, Ron Klein, before I get to one of the loves of my life, Ron Klein is extraordinarily able. And Elaine, without you, Ron Klein would not have been in the Congress of the United States. Elaine Bloom set the stage, if you will, and made the pitch that was absolutely essential to, sort of soften up the other side. And because of her focus, because of her energy, because of her toughness, she did that. And Ron, I know that you would give credit to Elaine for having accomplished that. But Elaine, you did a wonderful thing in providing an opportunity for Ron Klein to come to the Congress of the United States. He is a young man of extraordinary ability. He's only been there a few months, but he is really making a great difference in the Congress. Ron, we are so glad to have you with us. One of our majority makers, along with Steve Cohen. In any event, for 5 years I lived in Coconut Grove, went to elementary school in Coconut Grove, and then Ponce de Leon Junior High School, which is south of Miami, and then Coral Gables High School for a year and a half. The young lady who represents, not that particular area, but represents just a little north of there, has come to the Congress, and before she came to the Congress, she made an extraordinary difference. And she participated. And as such, now in her second term, she is a cardinal. I don't know about a young Jewish gal being a cardinal, but, it's a new world, right? She's a cardinal. She is the chair of the Legislative Appropriation Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. Now, you can imagine that every member of Congress is focused on the Legislative Subcommittee. Every member of Congress is focused on that subcommittee, so she has some real influence. And she cares passionately about issues. She's also a chief deputy whip. She's also a member of my advisory board. I don't know how Debbie Wasserman Schultz gets it all done, but she does. And you are extraordinarily lucky to have her as an advocate. And she welcomed me among her people. Now, with all due respect to Debbie's welcoming to her people, I believe we are one people. And the distinctions between us are not religious, ethnic, nationality, gender, any of the other arbitrary distinctions. The real important distinctions are, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, our character. And part of our character is our beliefs and our values, and how we are willing to support those values and stand up for that in which we believe and advocate that. Unfortunately, in America today, we have too many people who are prepared in the name of fighting terrorism or some other to denigrate civil liberties and civil rights. We have an Attorney General, frankly, in my opinion, who has dealt pretty fast and loose with the principles that have made this country great and have brought us at a low point throughout the world in terms of our credibility and the respect which our country has. I'm very concerned about that. I hope you are as well. because if there's anything the Jewish community understands better, perhaps than any other community in the world, is the importance of making sure that every individual is safe within the law and cannot be arbitrarily and capriciously adversely affected. That is a critical principle. I am proud to be a citizen in a country wherein the Jewish community feels safer than any other country in the world save Israel. That is a testament to the United States. And long may we adhere to that standard. Amy, thank you. Amy and Alan are wonderful friends of mine. We've been down there a number of times. They've been very generous, not only to me, but to so many others, because they believe passionately in the principles for which many of us stand. And Amy in particular, Alan's not here. Alan and I have had some discussions, and Amy's had discussions with Alan. But Amy, thank you very much for all you have done for your state and for your nation and for the principles for which you stand. You have been a wonderful representative. Now, I have just spent, and my staff laments this, probably 5 minutes or 7 minutes of the time I'm supposed to speak. And because this is not a really big speech, but I do want to say some things. And I want to say something about Susie Turnbull as well, who's here. Susie and I go back a long way. Susie is a leader in the Democratic Party, as you know, at the national level, as are so many of you in this room. But Susie has been a leader in Maryland and a leader at the national level. Susie, thank you for your great service to our party, to Montgomery County, your home, and to our state. But there aren't very many people in the country that I know of who have been any more faithful or hardworking or focused on the well-being of Democrats and our party and its success than Susie Turnbull. Congratulations and thank you. Now, let me say we ought to be congratulating Israel tonight. This is the 59th birthday, I think, or today, or is it tomorrow? Today, the 59th birthday of a great nation. A nation that is extraordinarily important, not only to us strategically, but morally it is important to us as well. And some forget why that is so. It was a struggle over half a century. The Balfour Resolution in 1917, and as we moved forward and then through the Second World War and the awful tragedy of the Holocaust, and the negligence of the United States of America and so many in the world who failed to respond when response ought to have been compelling, when response should have been a moral duty for our nation and other nations throughout the world, where they turned a blind eye. And we have said never again, never again. I was in Darfur 2 weeks ago. Never again, unfortunately, is happening again. It happened in Bosnia, and Elie Wiesel spoke at the Holocaust Memorial and urged President Clinton, before he was president, during the week of the inauguration, to focus on what was happening in Bosnia at that point in time. Unfortunately, we too frequently have to learn the lesson that our neglect results in the death and destruction and hurting and rape and assaulting of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Over 10 million people have died in Africa as a result of essentially genocide, and certainly in Darfur, where the Bashir government continues to not only be negligent, but be actively involved in the genocide that has gone on there. Your voices in that effort are critically important. We're frankly going to have an issue coming up that's going to be very controversial. Luckily, Dave Ransom's not here, who wrote this speech, and he won't know that I totally ignored his text. But we will be having a vote coming up in the not-too-distant future, probably sometime this summer, on the Armenian genocide. Ahmadinejad denies the fact that, of course, the Holocaust occurred. I'm going to speak of Iran in just a minute, but there are so many who deny the Armenian genocide. And one member asked, as a matter of fact, today in a discussion, look, it happened a long time ago. Why are we focused on that? And the reason, and my immediate response was, so it doesn't happen again. But that's going to be very controversial. Turkey is our friend and strong ally, and we don't want to poke them in the eye unnecessarily. But their failure to recognize the fact that a genocide occurred will, I think, not be good for the young people in Turkey not to understand that it's possible in their country. We in America think that it's not possible here. I hope it's not possible here. I am not convinced that it's not possible here. We have seen throughout our own history the denigration of human rights, redeemed, frankly, by so many of you in this generation during the 50s and 60s and 70s, where we've tried to live out the promise that America holds out for our citizens. But it is important for us to stand up. The United Nations talks a good game sometimes on human rights. The United Nations very, I think, undermining of its principles focus on Israel and the time that it spends on calling Israel to task, as opposed to calling those who use terrorism as a foreign policy to task, I think undermines its credibility and certainly its effectiveness. It talks, it does not do, and when it talks, it sometimes talks out of both sides of its mouth. So I'm concerned about the United Nations. But let me say something that I'm not concerned about, and that is the majority in the Congress of the United States unswerving, unshakable, and unchanging commitment to Israel's security, sovereignty, and continued viability. As I said before, not only is that a strategic imperative for the United States of America, it is as well a moral imperative of the United States of America. The United Nations, acting on the Balfour Declaration, but after the Second World War, set up not only a country but a sanctuary, set up a country in which the Jewish people resided. Did people move there? Yes, they did. But the Jewish people were there and had always been there. And we established a nation. We established a sanctuary. We established a place to which Jews could repair, even if other countries, as Nazi Germany and other countries have done, set up pogroms, set up divisions and segregation, and undermine the rights of its Jewish citizens. They would have a place to go. So many times in Moscow, we would end our meetings with next year in Jerusalem. Maybe the next day, the next week, the next month in Jerusalem, a place of safety. And we need to be very careful, because what the world set up was a Jewish state and a Jewish democracy. And if we do not proceed carefully, it will either not be a democracy or it will not be a Jewish state. And if either one of those is the result, then the world's purpose will have been misserved. And so the Congress of the United States, unanimously, no, but overwhelmingly, when you see the votes in the Congress of the United States, you see 400, you see 395, you see 410, 420, voting for propositions either against those like Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Ahmadinejad, others who would discriminate against the Jewish state, would discriminate against the Jewish people. Overwhelming unity within the Congress of the United States. Democrats and Republicans, Roy Blunt and Steny Hoyer, marching together, leading our parties to make sure that we meet that strategic and moral imperative of Israel's success. We have a resolution on the floor tomorrow condemning those who would use human shields in the perpetration of their ends. We must keep that light burning bright of freedom and security, not just for Israel. If we let the light out in Israel, it can be let out anywhere. If we let the light out in Israel, we will have failed ourselves as well as Israel. We won't do that. Iran poses an extraordinary threat. I want you to know that there are some who are talking about taking the military option off the table. I am not one of them. Not because I believe the military option is one that we ought to use, that would be practical to use, that would be effective to use right now. But I believe absolutely that Ahmadinejad and the Council in Iran ought to know that the United States understands that that is an option that is available to us as we try to exert pressure through sanctions, through our European friends and others to convince Iraq that we are very serious when we say a nuclear-armed Ahmadinejad and the Council is unacceptable to the international community and certainly to the United States as well as Israel. If we fail to prevent Iran having a nuclear weapon, we will then see an accelerated proliferation throughout the Middle East, where every nation concerned as we are by Iran, including Saudi Arabia, including other nations of the Middle East, will rush to get nuclear weapons themselves. And we will see a dangerous, unstable condition become even worse. And so it ought to be the commitment not only of the United States, but of the United Nations and the international community that Iran not be allowed to ultimately develop nuclear threats to the region. We have 250,000 Americans within range of nuclear weapons. This is not an esoteric somebody else's concern. This is our concern. It is Israel's concern. It is every resident of the Middle East's concern. It is the European concern. And I suggest to you it ought also be Russia's concern as well as China's concern. Hopefully we can mobilize effectively to successfully deter Iran, and if not, act. And if not, act. Let me just close, because I perhaps talked too long already, by saying that we've had a very successful agenda. This is a democratic council, and while you are very focused on Israel, while you're very focused on the values that the Jewish community in particular in our country has held so high, so faithfully for so long, you're also concerned, because you are Democrats, with the welfare of the community at large. We passed a 6 for 06, which we're very proud of. We passed the 9/11 Commission report to make us safer as a nation against Islamic jihadists who wish us evil and harm. We passed a minimum wage, which had not been passed in 10 years. People working 40 hours a week, living at the margins on the poverty line in America, the richest nation on the face of the earth. If it had only been adjusted since 1997 for the cost of living adjustment, the minimum wage today, which is $5.15, would be $9.05 an hour. All we're suggesting is to raise it over 2 years to $7.25. There's not one of us in this room would want to be purchasing goods at 2007 prices with $1997. So we passed that. Hopefully we'll get it through relatively soon. We passed a college interest bill which seeks to bring interest rates down for college students and their families. Why? For their students and families? Yes, but for a much larger purpose. If we're going to remain competitive in the new world order, in where the world is flat, it will be because every student in America that is able and wants to exercise their talents and develop them can go to college, can get higher education. That is in the national interest. Yes, it's in the interest of the student, but it is in the national interest. So we brought the interest rates down. We then addressed the energy issue, because if we're not energy independent, if we are hoist on the petard of reliance on Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Russia, other oil-producing nations that are not friendly to us, and some perhaps are friendly now, but may not be. If we remain energy dependent, it will be undermining of our national security. In addition to that, it is undermining our economy to be so price reliant on OPEC nations or Venezuela or some other nation that does not wish us well. It undermines our economy. And lastly, global warming is a threat. Our environment is critical to protect. It is very nice to be secure, but if we can't breathe in a secure country, or if our littorals, you know, the property along our shorelines are underwater and our cities are flooded as New Orleans was, that will cause us major economic and personal disruption. So global warming and energy independence is critical. We passed a bill which took back $14 billion of tax incentives to the big oil companies. Now, I don't have any attack on the big oil companies, but in a free enterprise system, a capitalist system, when your product is getting the largest price, the highest price it's ever gotten, Micah, you know this well, Josh and the Rails family know it well, if you're getting the highest price for your product, you don't need a tax incentive to find more product to sell, because you're making historic profits. So we took that money back, and what do? We put it in a trust fund. We put it in a trust fund for alternative energy and renewable energy research and development. That is good for our country. And then we looked at health. We have a lot to do on health care, but we said on prescription drugs. There's not one of us in this room that would go into a store or a market anywhere and say to somebody, I'll take 1 unit of that, whatever it is, and pay a price. And then the next day come in the store and say, I'll take 100 units of that, and expect to pay the same per unit price. None of us would do that, but that's what we're doing on prescription drugs. We could save 40% perhaps, as they do in the VA. So we passed that bill. The last bill we passed, the 6006, said we want to give additional hope to people who are afflicted with serious illness, Alzheimer's, diabetes, other afflictions of mankind. Scientists tell us that stem cell research may hold a cure or a palliative ameliorating effect for some of those illnesses. We passed that. We passed a CR, which is funding government for last year. This is a Democratic council, and they left 9 of the appropriation bills 9 of the 11 appropriation bills on the table when they left town. So we passed that. We got 57 Republican votes. And by the way, for those other bills, we got an average of 62 Republican votes. This was not a narrow partisan agenda, Mark, that we passed. It was an agenda that spoke to the needs and the desires of the American people. In closing, let me say this as Democrats, and we have a good friend of mine. I've known this young fellow since he was I guess 14 or 15. We had a primary in Maryland. Debbie had 2 of her people in this primary, Ben Cardin. Ben Cardin has been my friend for 40 years. He's one of my closest friends in life. One of the other very close friends I had, if I were asked to name 5 friends, Ben Cardin and Norman Rales would be on that list. Norman Rales has 4 extraordinary sons. One of them is Josh Rales, my friend of 30-plus years. Let me say something that I hope you Democrats were proud of, but you may not have focused on. In the senatorial primary in the state of Maryland, there was approximately $7 million spent on ads in the senatorial primary. Josh and Ben were the major spenders. $7 million in America on television ads. Not one negative ad. How proud can we be of Josh Rails and Ben Gordon? Not one negative ad, $7 million worth of ads. And I thought that was a great testament to Josh, a great testament to Ben, and a great testament to our Democratic Party. Thank you very much, Josh. And thank all of you. You have been so extraordinarily generous in your contributions, so passionately involved in your advocacy. You have made a difference for our country and for my children and my grandchildren. God bless you, and thank you.
Can you answer some questions?
Sure. Have a great speech.
Yeah. Leader Hoyer has agreed to answer some questions. Don't ask him about, he did 6 for 06. Don't ask him about the 2007 he's got ready for 2007. But anyway, who's got a question?
Yes. Elaine.
I don't know how to put it this way, but we are so very, very thrilled with the fact that you and the Senate, while not passing the identical legislation, have put the President on notice that we've got to do something different in Iraq. How can we help you, given the fact that the President is misstating everything about what you've done and what the effect will be?
Let me say I should have mentioned the supplemental, of course, because that's under consideration. We passed a supplemental appropriation. We passed a supplemental appropriation, and members of Congress, you would be proud of members of Congress, I hope, if you would see us, for instance, particularly the Democratic caucus. I don't participate in the Republican conference, but if you participated in that caucus, Elaine, and you saw the conscientious consideration, the agonizing about what the right thing to do was in that caucus, the intellect. I mentioned Jerry Nadler. Jerry Nadler has been very much a part of this debate and is himself torn by exactly what we ought to be doing, as is everybody in the caucus. What we have done, as all of you know, we passed in the House. The President said the Iraqis ought to accomplish certain benchmarks. We said, fine, we're for that. And we said they need to be accomplished. And if they're not accomplished, you have to get out sooner. We said, frankly, even if they are accomplished, the Iraqis need to take responsibility for this effort. We will get out by August 31st of next year, not a precipitous withdrawal, not saying that we're going to cut and run, as the President would say. And I'm not sure what the President means by surrendering. Surrender to whom? I don't know who he's talking about, surrender to whom. We have effectively, as every military advisor said, a civil war going on, a contention for power between Sunnis and Shia. Are there terrorists there? Are there people from outside Iraq? There are. They weren't there before we got there. They're now there. We even said in this resolution, you need to get out, but you can still fight the terrorists. If the terrorists are there, you can deploy them to fight the terrorists in Anbar province, the Al-Qaeda, and help either the Sunnis or the Shias who are being assaulted by them. But we said we need to extricate ourselves. That's what the Baker-Hamilton report said. This president obviously believes we ought to stay the course. He has the support of a very small percentage of the American public in that proposition. The majority of the country believes that we need to change direction, that we need to move in a new direction in Iraq. That's what we're trying to do. Now, the practical fact is that the President can veto any legislation we pass, and we can't override his veto now. We're going to move along a path. However, we'll pass, hopefully, the conference report. I think it'd be a huge mistake if we didn't pass the conference report. It is, as you know, closer to the Senate bill in some ways than it was to the House bill because we need to get the votes on the Senate floor to get it passed. We'll send it to the President either on Friday or on Monday. The President will veto it. We will then have a decision to make on what's the next step we take. And that's going to be discussed over the next few days as to figure out how that is. My prediction is we will move ahead, and essentially I think the Democratic Party will not be totally unified. I think at that point there will be some in our caucus, significant number in our caucus, who want to make it very clear that they think that the Barbara Lee, for instance, has an amendment which essentially says money appropriated can be used only for the purposes of redeployment. There will be others in our caucus who do not want to go that far at this point in time. But what we'll try to do is fashion a message to the President, realizing that we can't override his veto, a message to the President which continues to focus the American public on what's happening. We've lost about 3,300 people in Iraq. You lose people in wars, tragic fact, at least in some wars. Bill Clinton removed Milosevic, brought democracy back to Serbia, stopped the genocide of the Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Kosovo, and lost no single troop. That is not to say this president could have done that in this context, but we have lost 10% of the troops that we've lost in Iraq in the last 4 months. This is after the surge has been put in place. It's not completed, but it's after this policy change that theoretically was going to stabilize and make us more secure. I think most of us in Congress believe it is our responsibility to say that, Mr. President, staying the course of a failed course is not the policy the American public wants to support. So that's where we are at this point in time. Elaine will be struggling with that as we move forward.
My boss says we got one more question. So, Bill, you want to do it?
I'll just ask a question. I guess as a lawyer, I'm embarrassed by our Attorney General. I think that an Attorney General has to hold to a higher standard than other members of a cabinet. And I'm wondering what you think is going to happen with a president who seems to give thumbs up to something everybody else thought was a national disgrace.
Now, this president is not good at taking advice and counsel. And it is a dangerous situation that we find ourselves in. To have a president who does not listen to advice and counsel. None of us, the democracy works well because we are collegial. Our system demands that we're collegial because we don't have a dictator. This president, whether he's dealing with the Congress, and he's dealt with, over the last 6 years, a complicit, complacent Congress. No oversight, no checks and balances, essentially. And he's vetoed one bill, the stem cell research bill, not because he didn't like legislation that was being considered, but because the Congress would not pass legislation that he did not like. That's a dangerous situation for our country. Now we come to the Attorney General. I tell people that I think the Attorney General either ought to step down or be removed. I do not think that because of the firing of the U.S. attorneys. I think the firing of the U.S. attorneys for political reasons, for them not pursuing vigorously enough or pursuing too vigorously wrongdoing. Either you take your choice. They were concerned about both ends. I think that would have been cause enough. But if I were removing the Attorney General, I would tell you I would remove the Attorney General. I would have never appointed the Attorney General. An Attorney General or an Attorney General candidate or a counsel to the President that gives him advice and counsel that the Geneva Convention is passé, is not archaic, antiquated, I think is the, quaint was the word he used. An Attorney General that does that, an Attorney General that rationalizes the undermining of the Fourth Amendment, and a critical protection for American citizens. An Attorney General who doesn't know that the FBI under his aegis is using letters of national security letters in a profligate way, unjustified either by the threat, by the individuals involved. An Attorney General who says that habeas corpus is not something that we are going to support. Habeas corpus, after all, the bulwark of protection against government. I thought Republicans, I thought conservatives were fearful of centralized power in government. I thought they wanted to be on guard and check against government abuse and capricious activity. Habeas corpus is designed for exactly that purpose. Let me give you an example, and I know Mark wants to get out of here, and I know you've been participating a long time, and I don't know how you got the poor Steny Hoyer to talk to you. I looked at the list of who's talking. They're all running for president. I am not running for president. This year. But let me say that I think the Attorney General's performance before he became Attorney General disqualified him from being Attorney General, very frankly. And I wish the President would get the message. Certainly, you know, so many Republican members of the United States that are trying to send him that message. Hopefully, he'll hear it. Thank you all very much.
Leader Hoyer, I generally don't want to speak on behalf of an entire organization unless I'm sure what I'm saying is true. But on behalf of our thousands of members, I believe I can safely say that we are so excited that the American public and your colleagues replace that dirty, rotten exterminator with someone as honest and smart and capable as you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Folks, Ira wants to tell you about the schedule for tomorrow. 1 second, and we're out of here. Ira, come on.
Good morning. I can tell you how wonderful it is to see this organization growing to this level and more. Thank you so much for being a part of it and making sure that Israel and the Jewish community is in the forefront of the democratic effort. I have such a privilege and pleasure today because I'm about to introduce one of my idols, actually two of my idols. One of them is a man who my husband and I have looked up to for so long. He said something some time ago which I think carries so much truth with it. He said there is no education without love. And he has carried that message not only in Texas and in the University of Texas at Austin, where he created a scholarship. But this is what's interesting about this scholarship. It's the spirit of giving scholarship, which gives students who donate their time and effort to the community a chance at a $10,000 scholarship. And a sixth of his foundation goes to those children. And his wife, of course, Audrey, as well. But more than that, a third of his foundation goes towards Israel. And just recently, my husband and I were in Israel. And the most amazing thing that we saw was the athletic club for children in East Jerusalem for the Palestinian children. When we talk about winning the hearts and minds, and we talk about diplomacy, at the root of it all is action. And as we were walking through, people kept saying, well, B. Rappaport did this. B. Rappaport did this. And by the time we finished, and as I saw the Palestinian children playing sports there with Israeli children, and then somebody mentioned to me that B. Rappaport was involved in creating a zoo, because at one point in his life he saw Israeli children and Palestinian children with their arms around each other. And he said, a zoo can do that. We can have Palestinian children and Israeli children visit a place that has common ground. And B has done so much more than that, but it would take me like all the time to tell you that. But I just want to tell you, B, that from the bottom of my heart, on behalf of every child in Israel and every Palestinian child, I thank you, and we all thank you. And I want you to come up because I'm going to say a few words about my friend Hillary, but I want you also to be able to say a few words because you know her so well. And by the way, I tell him that B is for boyfriend. And he told me that I need to tell my husband that he needs to watch out, so I like that. And now, I want to talk about a woman that I have known now for 16 years. There's a great personal story attached to it, but I don't want to get into it in detail because it would take too long. But I have a daughter. She was 5 years old when I met her in a homeless mission. She was an abused, neglected, and at age 5, she wasn't even toilet trained. I couldn't turn my back to this child because it kept nagging at me, although I really wanted to turn my back because I knew that the minute I stepped forward, it would be a lifetime of commitment. And it has become a lifetime of commitment. And this child, I became her mentor, then her foster parent, then we adopted her. But as I did that, I faced the reality of what the system is all about, the child welfare system. And it struck me because this child was almost choked to death by a crack mom. And when she was revived, she was going to be returned to the parent. And I said over my dead body, and of course I didn't have any rights. But I wrote faxes at that time to everybody on the Hill. And it thrilled me when Hillary Clinton took on the cause. And the laws, there was a reunification clause in the Family Preservation Act which made it so impossible. It would take 4.5 years for a child to be adopted that anybody wanted to. And because of Hillary, these children were able to get a future and be adopted and have caring families. Well, my child was able to be the first adoption on Adoption Saturday in Los Angeles because of Hillary Clinton, and therefore, I always say that Hillary saved Michelle's life. So I personally want to tell you how important you are in our lives and in my daughter's life. Thank you. I was born in Israel, and I grew up with the American flag and the Israeli flag crisscrossed above my bed because my grandfather so believed in the Statue of Liberty. He always talked about the line, give me your poo and huddle as long as they believe in freedom. And I dreamt of coming to this country because he said that America was the best friend Israel could ever have and that the survival of Israel depended on it. He built the first synagogue on Dizengoff Street. He was Ben-Gurion's best friend. And just this morning, I spoke to Dalia Rabin, who I grew up with, and I told her that I was about to introduce Hillary, and she said, tell her three words. I said, what is it? And she said, we need you. I think that tells so much. What most people, and I would like every one of you to go and talk to people about it, we need somebody who understands the differences in our cultures, who understand not only our culture in Israel and what we strive for, and how hard people fight and sacrifice their children for peace. We need somebody who also understands the culture on the other side of the fence. Because peace is really not just a word. It's finding a common ground like bee found in a zoo. It's finding a common ground for people to come together to create a world that eliminates some of the violence. And it takes somebody who's not going to practice on the job, but somebody who understands how to get in there and talk to people and understand them and come from their point of view so that we can start thinking collectively about the center of this planet being in better shape than it is now. Well, Hillary is that person because she knows. She's been in Israel from before she was First Lady of Arkansas. She took the home instruction of preschool youngsters in Israel to Arkansas and realized that in order to get kids school ready, we needed to educate them in their homes. She is the one that understands that we're facing now broken souls of children with dangerous toys so often. And she's the one who's going to be able to bring both the understanding and the reality into action. Many people don't know, but Hillary Clinton has been involved in authoring or co-authoring over 600 legislations since she's been in the Senate. That is a huge amount that tells us that she does the job. And in every room that I come to nowadays, there's one thing nobody can deny, and that is that Hillary Clinton does a great job and will do a great job as president. So please, Hillary, please if you can come up here and just say a few words for Hillary. Thank you so much.
Well, you know, after listening to her, I'll tell you what I remembered. You'll get a kick out of this, Hillary. My grandmother, who came to this country when she was about 70, and I about 5, 6 years old, and I'd be walking to the synagogue with her, and she said to me, "Now I want you to marry a nice Jewish girl." And I said, "Bubby, what's more important, that she be nice or that she be Jewish?" She says, "If she's Jewish, she's nice." Anyways, I want to just take a couple minutes to tell you. I've known this young lady over 35 years. This is a woman that I don't think of her as a woman president. I think of her as a person president. Hillary Clinton is somebody that does not need on-the-job training, and that's what this country needs right now more than it's ever needed, that kind of president, and Hillary Clinton is that kind. She has deep concern for the poor. She knows that a country in which 1%, and I have to be in that 1%, have more wealth than the bottom 100 million is not a sustainable society, and that is not tolerable if we want a democratic society. It's an insult to our populace that we do not give health insurance to every American. And let me tell you what this is in her blood. She's gonna bleed if we don't get that done, and she's the one that can get it done, and will get it done. Okay, now I'm going to take just a couple more minutes, and let me tell you what I want to tell you. I have many friends in this campaign, and as they came before Hillary announced, they came to me, and I helped every one of them. I said, I just want you to understand one thing. If Hillary is running, that is where our support will be. First, because that's the way I want it, but secondly, my wife would divorce me if I did. But I want to say to you that all of us here have friends in it. But this campaign is so all-important in many ways. The one that succeeds, this individual who is the single worst president in the history of our nation, the person that takes that mess over has to be someone He's already had all the experiences that Hillary's had. And I want to tell you a personal story about Hillary. I think Bill was Attorney General or maybe Governor, I don't remember when. But Audrey had never been to Little Rock. And they had a nice party. There were a lot of people there. When we walked in, Hillary walked up to Audrey and says, "Audrey, I know you don't know anybody here." And Hillary took Audrey and introduced her to every single person there. And all during that time that we were at that party, she kept her eye on Audrey to be sure that Audrey was taken care of. That's the kind of Hillary Clinton is on a personal basis. She's great in a public situation. She's great in a private situation. She is going to be, must be, the next president of the United States.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. Wow. Gosh, I could just sit here and listen to these nice stories all day. I feel like I'm at a family reunion. I'm so grateful to all of you for what you're doing here and the organization that you're building and the understanding you have about the importance of bringing the values that motivate all of you into the Democratic Party and our country. I want to thank my friends. Daphne, thank you so much. I hope more of you get to meet Daphne's daughter, Michelle, who is an absolutely extraordinary young woman. Daphne and her husband really walk the walk. They don't just ask that institutions and systems change. They roll up their sleeves and try to do it in the most personal way. And I'm grateful for your friendship and your leadership. And to this day, Daphne is one of our nation's leaders on trying to improve the treatment and outcomes for foster care children, particularly those who've been neglected and abused, and also to improve our adoption system. And what does one say about B. Rappaport? He is a force of nature. I have been privileged to know him and his wonderful wife for even longer, I think, than, it seems like it goes back to the very beginning. But he has set a model for so many of us that, doing well in this country is a great gift and blessing. And particularly for someone like B, who's very conscious of, his family's roots and where they came from, he wakes up every day and is just so grateful to be in America and to have the chances he's been given, and he wants to keep giving back so more and more people can do the same. Not only has he done wonderful work in Israel, as Daphne was describing, but I have visited the projects that he and Audrey fund in Waco and throughout Texas and America that focus on trying to help families and children. So I'm very grateful to you. I want to acknowledge my friends on the head table. Obviously, I'm grateful to be here with all of them, Mark and Arthur and, Michael and, Sunita Leeds, who gave me this unbelievably fabulous gift. Some of you were there. The NJDC honored me, and I got a gold shofar. I thank you for that. And Mark, thank you for your leadership and your organization of this important group and this policy conference. There's so many old friends in the room that I would be just here all day, and I wouldn't say anything about these important issues if I were to acknowledge all of you. But I could not be more grateful to you for your friendship and support over the years. And what you did for Democrats in this last election cycle was just phenomenal. You really did help to lay the groundwork for the Democratic majority that we now have in the House and the Senate. And with your help, we're going to increase those Democratic numbers and take back the White House. 08 will be even better. Because it has been such a long 6 years. And I was talking earlier to some of the members who met me as I came in, and I said, this election has taken off so quickly. I've never seen anything like it. Everybody wants to participate. All of the states want to be at the front of the line. And I believe it's because America wants to turn the page on the Bush-Cheney administration.
They want to get to the future as fast as we can. If they could, go through time and just end the interim that we are having to live through, they would make that choice. Because after all, what have we seen? We've seen our government become more incompetent, more unqualified cronies put into positions of power they were not prepared for or capable of carrying out, no-bid contracts, the outsourcing of our government. There are now more private contractors by a factor of 3 than there are civilian and military government employees and workers. And in the process, they have tried to turn Washington into an evidence-free zone, where what mattered was ideology and the pure, unadulterated use of power. We're seeing that now in the inquiry that's going into the firing of U.S. attorneys who would not pursue a political agenda. We've seen it repeatedly with government scientists muzzled and information taken off of government websites that didn't fit an ideological profile. And we continue to see the president and the vice president and their allies calling anyone who disagrees with them unpatriotic. So this has been a difficult 6 years. I worry that we don't even know all the damage that's been done. I kiddingly say to people that I'll walk into the Oval Office well aware of the record of cronyism and corruption and incompetence and deception, and then I'll pick up the rug in the Oval Office and find so much stuff under there I won't know where it came from. This is not like picking up socks from the floor. This will be really hard work trying to reverse the damage that this administration has inflicted on our country. And really the people, and particularly the families of America, are paying the price. The rising health care costs are squeezing so many people. You've got incomes and wages have been flat while productivity is up and CEO pay is up and corporate profits are up. And, as we heard from B, the people in the top 0.1% are doing so much better. And then if you go down to the top 10%, you've got the remaining 90% who've in effect been taking pay cuts, while those of us who have been privileged to do well have been doing even better. We've got 12 million children living in poverty. We have more people going bankrupt than we have college graduates. And we're just not able to focus on these because to this president, these people and their problems are basically invisible. He doesn't see them. So, if you're a single mom trying to work and maybe go to college to further your education and get a better job, and you don't have child care, you don't have after-school care, you're invisible to this president. If you're a small business owner who's facing rising energy costs both at the pumps and in the electric utility bills, you're invisible too. And if you're a soldier who was wounded in Iraq or Afghanistan doing your service to our country, and you came back to Walter Reed where you have to fight another battle to get the care you deserve, until recently you were also invisible. You just can't imagine the stories that I hear every day. As a senator from New York, where people come to me asking for my help, and now as a candidate traveling around the country. There's so many people who can't afford college anymore. That is an issue that when I mention it, whether it's in New Hampshire, Iowa, or anywhere else, the crowds, whatever they are composed of, burst into applause. Because it is so much more difficult for a middle-income family to afford to send a child to college than it was when I went to school. And part of that is because there's been no oversight of the student loan industry. And what we have found is that money that should go to loans for hardworking families and students has been siphoned off for other purposes. And there's been so many conflicts of interest, and the person overseeing the program in the Department of Education was taking stock from one of the companies. If you're one of the 90,000 people still living in trailers along the Gulf Coast, President came, made a speech, went back to Washington, and told Karl Rove he was in charge of Gulf Coast reconstruction. And it's a continuing disgrace that we haven't taken better care of our fellow citizens. Well, there are so many there are so many examples like that, and I bet everyone here could put in your own favorite. But we have to, as Democrats, make it abundantly clear that everybody in this country will be visible to us, that we're going to work to enhance the opportunities of the many, not to help the few. Because that's why America has worked so well for the last centuries. We've always had this forward movement where people believed that their government, was not putting roadblocks in their way, but actually on their side as they tried to find a better future for themselves. Former and great Supreme Court Justice Brandeis once said that democracy is moral before it is political. I think that's really important. I just came across that quote recently. Democracy is moral before it is political. It teaches us a lot. I mean, one of the reasons we're having all this trouble around the world, trying to impose democracy in places where it has not exactly taken fruit, or where what we have are people like Hamas coming into power and perverting democracy, is because the moral basis for democracy has not been laid. So we have to ask ourselves, what are our values? Justice Brandeis was telling us that democracy is not neutral. We have certain principles and rules by which we operate, but it is based on core values. The belief that the circumstances of your birth should not determine the limits of your potential, that we have an obligation to protect the rights of the least powerful against the designs of the most powerful, that whether your ancestors came here in first class or steerage or in chains, you have an equal shot at the American dream, that free expression and open debate is fundamental, as is access to education so that you can be prepared to exercise your rights. And I know that the NJDC is committed to these core values. And you're Democrats because you feel so strongly that we need to implement these values in our policies. I think the American people are ready to return to these ideals. They're ready for leaders who will listen, who will see them, who will work together. And they're ready for America to start living up to our best values again. And I'm certainly ready to do that. I'm ready to reach out to those who have been left behind, pushed aside. I am ready to bring people together, as I have in the Senate, and to roll up our sleeves and begin the work that will improve conditions in America and restore our leadership around the world. It is the #1 mission of the next president. We have to convince ourselves, first and foremost, that we are the America that we can believe in again, that we will meet the challenges that we know are awaiting us, and that once again, we will reclaim not just our leadership as a superpower, but our leadership as a moral authority in the world. And that is what I intend to do. And I want to start setting some goals again. As a little girl, I remember we had goals in America. I felt like I was a small part of it. When Russians sent the satellite into space and everybody in America was so concerned, I remember my 5th grade teacher coming into our classroom and telling us that the president wanted us to study math and science. And I was convinced that President Eisenhower had called Mrs. Krause and told her to tell us that. And when President Kennedy said we'd send a man to the moon and bring him back safely in a decade, I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I was absolutely convinced it would, because after all, that's who we were. We solved problems. We were the practical visionaries, and we set goals that everybody could participate in meeting. So let's set the goal of universal health care coverage. Let's once and for all decide we're going to provide quality, affordable health care to every American. You know the statistics, nearly 47 million uninsured and many millions more who are underinsured. They've got insurance all right, but when it comes time for them to get the treatment that their doctor has prescribed for them, the insurance company says, just kidding. We're not going to actually let you do that. My office spends countless hours trying to help people with insurance get the health care that their doctors have told them that they and their children need. So when a man calls me from northern New York and tells me that his child has just been diagnosed with a terrible, rare illness, and their doctor has told them that the best place in the country to save their child's life is in another state, and their insurance company, which has insured them for years, says we don't do that, we're not going to pay for that. So they come to me, and I get involved, and my staff gets involved, and eventually, we get them to back down and to agree. Of course, I'm relieved and happy for that family, but I'm thinking to myself, most people don't go to their United States senator to get the health care that they think they're entitled to under their insurance policy. And it should not take a senator to make sure that a child can have the best treatment that child deserves to have. We know that the costs in this system have continued to go up. Premiums have risen by 90% since 2000. And many people just don't know how they're going to afford insurance for themselves or for their employees. So we not only have to bring everybody into the system, we have to make the system more efficient. And we have to guarantee better quality. Because although we spend more money by far on health care than anyone in the world, we don't get the best results, which absolutely makes no sense to me, because Americans are well known for getting the best bargain we can get, trying to drive that hard bargain, not when it comes to health care. So there is an opportunity that we will seize when I'm president. We also will take a different path when it comes to scientific research. We've seen the budgets for NIH cut under this president, and we've seen ideological opposition to scientific advances like stem cell research. It is time for us to proceed with stem cell research. We've passed it twice in the Congress. And we're going to try to override the president's veto, which he has promised. But what we really need is a president who will stand up for science and stand up for scientists and stand up for new research that will give us cures, that will help us and our children lead healthier lives. We also have to make some commitments to education. And Daphne mentioned my belief that education starts in the family. And I think all of us in this room believe that. How do we help parents become a child's first teachers? And I was so impressed by the HIPPY program, the Home Instruction Program for Preschool Youngsters, back in like 1983, that I tracked down Dr. Avima Lombard, a professor at Hebrew University who had pioneered the program, and convinced her to bring it to Arkansas. Well, now I want, as president, to provide access to quality preschool for children who need that extra help. We know it will make a difference. We have the many years of research from Head Start, and the Federal Reserve Board of Minneapolis has just done a study asking themselves what one thing could we do that would make our country more competitive in the future. And they looked at all the research and they came back and said, invest in preschool education. It has such a payoff for kids being more productive as they go into adulthood. We obviously need to be serious about energy, something this president and vice president have not been. We need a new energy policy that really focuses on research and development and quicker application of technology that's already existing. I want to create an agency comparable to what we did after Sputnik went up. We then created something called the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and out of it came the Internet. It was government-funded research, partnering with the great universities in our country and with private sector research operations, like in those days, Bell Labs and others, and we created so much positive value that it has really fueled the economy. Most of our economic growth since World War II has been fueled by scientific research. When it comes to energy, we need those minds having the resources to be able to move us toward alternatives. We need to set some goals like having 20% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2020, 25% by 2025. I saw Cam Carey here. Senator Carey and I have introduced legislation together to try to make the federal government a leader in green buildings. Federal government owns 500,000 buildings. They should set the example for how we get more energy efficient buildings, and by the way, create markets for new building materials and appliances that then the private market can go ahead and utilize as well. There's so much work to be done here, and it goes hand in hand with dealing with global climate change. You've got to do both in order to have a realistic policy. And let's also make it clear that I will appoint judges who will uphold the rule of law and follow precedent under our Constitution. Last week's Supreme Court decision was a wake-up call. It marked an abrupt and dramatic departure from 4 decades of Supreme Court rulings upholding the right to choose and protecting women's health. I hate to say I told you so, but this was exactly the erosion of constitutional rights that I warned about when I voted against both Justices Roberts and Alito. And if the court is willing to undermine established precedent when it comes to a woman's right to choose, what are they going to do when they turn their attention to religious liberty or the separation of church and state? Now, I am a person of faith, and I certainly don't believe that religion should be absent from our daily lives or even from our public square. But I also believe that our founding fathers intended that the First Amendment would make it clear that the government would neither endorse nor oppose any particular faith. Because once we allow state-sponsored religion in our public places, then at best we make those who are not religious feel like, interlopers, but at worst we begin a slippery slide that will undermine basic rights of conscience and freedom of association. No one should feel that way in our country. They should not feel excluded, disrespected, or marginalized. And I'm also very grateful for the strong spotlight that the Rutgers basketball team and their coach have shown on the degradation and demeaning of women, because that has to stop as well. It is not just about women. Many people in our country are marginalized, but at the same time, we've got to stand up and say enough is enough. And if we do that, then I think we can begin to, heal and patch together a society that has been deliberately divided through political tactics and techniques over the last 15 or so years. Now, finally, we have our work cut out for us around the world. Any of you who travel, and I assume most of you do, have encountered this. Our reputation is in shreds. People don't trust us anymore. I had a diplomat from an Arab country say to me the other day, one of the countries that were trying to help to manage the situation in Iraq and to deal with the very threatening presence of Iran. He said, but the problem is, Senator, that to be a great power, you must be either feared, respected, or liked. And right now, in too many places, the United States is none of those. Think about that. I mean, that is chilling. That undercuts our capacity to do what we know we must in the world. It is a threatening and dangerous world. I have certainly been one of those in our party who has continued to say we face real threats, and we've got to figure out how we're going to manage those. And that begins with our unwavering support for our friend and ally Israel. We stand with Israel because it is a beacon of democracy in a neighborhood that is shadowed by radicalism, extremism, despotism, and terrorism. Its very existence is a defiant rebuke to anti-Semitism. And we have shared values, to go back to Brandeis's point. We are founded on a common bond, and our bond and our values are exemplified every day in our vigorous democracies. I don't know if there is a more vigorous democracy than Israel. I often say, as a senator from New York, I represent 19 million people, all of whom have strong opinions. But I think Israel, you can quadruple or quintuple that. And that is one of the reasons we admire Israel and why we feel so strongly that it has to be protected and supported. Our commitment to civic engagement, to the rule of law, to open debate and free expression, they're not just found in the Knesset. They're found in every coffee shop and in every street corner in Tel Aviv. So to me, this goes right to that moral basis for democracy. And as you know, proud members of the NJDC, Democrats have always stood with Israel. going back to the very beginning with President Truman's decision. And of course, there's another Democratic president I'm very fond of, and I know I'm biased, but I well remember the long days and nights of negotiations and phone calls trying to figure out a way to create an environment in which Israel's security was guaranteed and the Palestinians were given the opportunity to take responsibility for themselves. Obviously, today, we face an even more dangerous set of circumstances. If you have any doubt about that, just look to some of Israel's neighbors. What happened in Lebanon with Hezbollah last summer, what's happening within the Palestinians with Hamas's rejectionist attitude and commitment to violence and the overthrow and extinction of Israel as an independent state, and certainly what is happening in Iran. This is a country that had its government host a conference in Tehran for the sole purpose of denying the Holocaust, placing its governmental leadership in the same company as the most despicable bigots and historical revisionists, a country whose elected leader has called for Israel to be wiped off the map, a country which we know has a long history of funding terrorism from Lebanon to Argentina, a country which has used its influence to be a difficult and dangerous presence in the Middle East, upsetting what balance of power there was. So let me be clear. We cannot, we should not, and we must not permit Iran to build or acquire nuclear weapons. That has to be our starting point. And in dealing with this threat, no option can be taken off the table. And I think it's important that we look at all the options that are available to us, some of which have been considerably narrowed because of this administration's policies. If the administration had been smarter about engaging with Iran, Syria, and others, I'm not saying that we'd be further along or that our situation or that Israel's dangers would be lessened. But I am saying that a process of direct engagement with these adversaries is important for several reasons. Our president currently says his policy is, I don't talk to bad people. I don't think that's a very smart policy when it comes to managing the threats we face. I believe it has been a mistake, and we have lost valuable time. You know, the best analogy is probably the Cold War, where the Soviet Union had thousands of missiles pointed at us, where they had leaders who threatened to bury us, where they ran proxy wars against us, invaded other countries. We never stopped talking to them. Did that mean that we did not defend our values vigorously? No. Did it mean that we let down our guard and didn't continue to build up our deterrence threat? No. But what it did mean is that we gained valuable insight, intelligence, and information about how to bring leverage on the leadership in the former Soviet Union. And as presidents, Republican and Democrats alike, followed that strategy, we also gave hope to people behind the Iron Curtain, that there would be perhaps a time when they would be free again. When it comes to Iran, we don't really even know who makes the decisions. I personally don't believe Ahmadinejad makes the decisions. I think he's the front man. I think he's the puppet. I think he's the guy they trot out to keep everybody, you know, in some kind of a turmoil. I think it is the clerical leadership and the supreme leader who calls the shots. And we do know enough to know that the Revolutionary Guard is under their control, not under the elected secular political leadership. So we are just wasting time instead of trying to figure out how we can bring pressure and leverage on who the real decision makers are. We also used to have a very strong pro-democracy and even pro-American element within Iran because it is such a young country. You know, depending upon who's giving you the statistics, it's like 50 to 70% below the age of 30. They are tuned in to our culture. They are on the internet. We are failing at public diplomacy. We still haven't gotten it right. We still don't have a vigorous effort to convey American values, to draw the contrast. We did that all through the Cold War, too. Radio Free Europe and all of the other tools at our disposal kept people feeling hopeful, gave heart to the dissidents. They were thrown in prison or otherwise intimidated and harassed. They always believed that America was there trying to help them. We need to do that again. And finally, if we do have to take offensive military action against Iran, it would be far better if the rest of the world saw it as a position of last resort, not first resort, because the effects and consequences will be globally felt. We also need to be much more publicly vigorous in insisting that Hezbollah and Hamas immediately and unconditionally release the 3 kidnapped soldiers that they continue to hold captive. I have visited twice with the very impressive young wife of one of those soldiers, Karnit Goldwasser, and other family members who have come to see me. She is an extraordinary young woman, and I was deeply moved by her resolve to find a way to free her husband and her love for him. Last month, I joined with one of my colleagues to introduce a resolution officially demanding the return of these soldiers and to expressing America's vigorous and unwavering support for Israel. It passed by unanimous consent, and I will continue to do everything I can to help bring those brave young men back to their families. Now let me conclude by just saying a few words about the war in Iraq. We all know that the President decided to wage a preemptive war before the inspectors from the United Nations finished their work. We now all know that the President was not prepared for the war that he was determined to wage. And we know that he and his team of decision makers have exhibited breathtaking misunderstanding and mismanagement, and that the war has tarnished America's reputation and standing in the world. The lesson to be drawn here, there are many, but the one I want to mention today, is not that the United States should withdraw from the world or shrink our role in standing up for freedom and democracy. If we do so, if we turn our back on the dangers that we face today, that will not only hurt us in the long run, but it will hurt Israel as well. So we need to do everything we can to find the right way to end this war, to bring our troops home and to get back to the hard work of trying to manage and deal with the world as it is, not as we wish it were. I have no illusions about how hard this work will be. I've seen firsthand the challenges that confront a president. But I believe strongly that we can succeed. I'm going into this campaign with my eyes wide open. I have no illusions about how difficult the tasks ahead of us will be. But I don't think we have a choice. I don't think we can let this drift and denial continue any longer past the end of this president's terms in office. And when I think of the work ahead of us, I think about a wonderful story that my friend, former Secretary Madeleine Albright, told me. In 1995, Bill asked her to go to Europe to attend commemorations of the end of World War II, the 50th anniversary of its end. She traveled around Europe, and she went to the former Czechoslovakia, where, as you know, she was born. And she went all around the country, attending large and small gatherings of people who wanted to mark this milestone. And everywhere she went, she saw people waving American flags. Now, that's not unusual. It's actually very welcome. But as she looked more closely, she saw that the flags only had 48 stars. These were flags that American GIs had handed out when they liberated Czechoslovakia. These were flags that Czechs had carefully safeguarded for 50 years. They had kept them hidden from the communists. When the tanks rolled into Prague, that was one of the first things these families told Madeleine that they carefully protected, because they so believed in America. They believed in our values. They believed we were a moral democracy, and they wanted to be like us. That's what I want people around the world to feel again about us. And that's, even more importantly, what I want us to feel about our great country. Thank you all very much.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Yes, absolutely. Oh, my God. That's amazing.
Wow, that was fantastic. Senator Clinton, thank you for your leadership. The NJDC, for the Jewish community, and especially for our nation and for the world. The senator will take a few questions, so please, back there.
Senator Clinton.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your appearance here today. We all enjoyed it. What's on everybody's mind is, in your presidency, what will be the role of your husband?
Well, I believe that presidents should use former presidents, and I've seen it work. In fact, as we speak, former President Bush and Bill are attending Yeltsin's funeral. President Bush sent his father and Bill to represent our country in dealing with the tsunami, and it did a world of good for America. You know, after Bill and former President Bush were in Indonesia, the Indonesians' attitudes toward the United States went up dramatically. So there's going to be a lot of work for him to do around the world, because I think when I'm elected, even between the election and the inauguration, we need to send out distinguished Americans to every country in the world to tell them that America is back as your, leader and inspiration. We want to work with you. And there are many Americans who can serve that role, but I don't know anyone better who can convey that message to people everywhere than Bill, and I will certainly take advantage of his experience and his extraordinary standing in the world today. Yes.
It's on now. Thank you so much for being here. You spoke about pressure and leverage on Iran, and we're seeing around the country state legislation about divesting from investments with foreign companies that are working with Iran, policemen, firefighters, teachers whose pensions are invested in supporting terrorism and supporting funding that is harming our troops. And I'm wondering if you're hoping to bring this up on the federal level, and if you'll be one of the ones to champion that effort on the federal stage.
I think it's a great idea. I think it's called being called Disinvest in Terrorism. I think that's the name of the campaign. And I think it's something we really have to look at. We have legislation to try to toughen the sanctions on Iran, and I'm certainly supportive of that. But I think all of that is beneficial. And I would just take the model of what the administration finally had to do with North Korea. We won't go into that because it's a not very, it's a long and not very happy story, because we're playing catch up now since they actually did test nuclear weapons. But we did sanctions, we did multi-party negotiations, and we did bilateral negotiations. We did it all across the board. And we're trying to get North Korea back into the bottle, which is hard. But, I think with Iran, you've got to look at all of those. Tough sanctions, working with our allies around the world to help enforce those sanctions, which is, as you know, difficult. But the United Nations Security Council at least has made a step in that direction. And then trying to get Iran engaged in these regional conferences about Iraq. I applaud the Secretary of State for having said repeatedly she hopes Iran will show up at this regional stability and security conference. And then engaging with Iran, trying to, in effect, gauge, who's really calling the shots and what we can do to try to pressure them. Yes.
Senator, B mentioned the number of wonderful pieces of legislation you introduced. I want to comment that one you introduced related to survivors of the Holocaust who are living at or below the level of poverty in the United States. The reason I mention it is it's one thing, as we know, those of us who've worked on the Hill, about introducing. It's another thing knowing what you're introducing.
Thank you.
And what you did was extremely important, And the key now is to make sure it passes.
Right.
Because you have 50% of the problem in New York State alone. And after what these folks went through, they can't tolerate it anymore.
Well, thank you very much for
Thank
saying
you.
that. Thank you. Yes, back there.
You've been a real champion on the issue of child abuse of Palestinian children. You've really been the national leader in standing up against a culture of hate, the incitement that encourages small Palestinian children to be suicide bombers. So I wanted to first congratulate you on that, and secondly ask you if you plan to extend that to Iranian children who are taught the same things in their school books.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we should generally extend it to all those who basically use propaganda and disinformation to pollute the minds of young children and turn them into terrorists, into suicide bombers. Everything we know happens. We don't have as much leverage on Iran. You know, with the Palestinian textbooks, we've had this continuing debate. I first raised this issue back in '99 with Elie Wiesel. And unfortunately, the latest versions of the textbooks, some of them funded with European Union money, are not any better. You know, they're still showing maps that don't have Israel on them and so much else. And then the public media in that the Palestinians put out is, you know, kind of like music videos in, you know, support of and honoring suicide bombers. So it's a terrible abuse of children, in my opinion. This happens in other countries, as we know, and I've raised it with leaders of other Arab countries, and I think we just have to keep, you know, making it an issue and pointing out that it's a breeder of the very attitudes and actions that we find so reprehensible. Yes?
More question.
Oh, okay. My take on immigration is that we need comprehensive immigration reform. And by that, I mean we do have to do a much better job in securing our borders. I mean, I've been saying that since 9/11. We all remember that we had some of the hijackers here legally. Their visas expired and nobody knew they were here. We still don't have a very good system to track people who come into the country legally, and we're only now beginning to tighten our borders. So, you know, we have to start with strong, secure borders, more personnel, more technology. We have to make it very clear that employers will pay a price if they continue to employ undocumented workers. I mean, people come here because they know they'll get a job. And, you know, I bet if all of us were transported into some very poor village in southern Mexico or Central America, and we were the people we are with our DNA and our ambitions and our motivations, we'd be among those making that dangerous trek because we weren't given an opportunity to really live up to our God-given potential. And that leads me to the third point, which is we have to think of more ways to pressure and incentivize these governments to our south so that they begin to provide economic opportunities. You know, they have not managed their economies for the benefit of the vast majority of their fellow citizens. And until they do, we're not going to have enough economic growth to really stem all of the illegal immigration. And finally, we have to both help local communities that are bearing the costs for education, health care, law enforcement, and we do need a path to legalization. We need to bring the 11 or 12 million people who are here illegally out of the shadows. I want them all registered. I think it's a national security issue. We need to find out who they are, where they live, what their track record has been. They need to pay fines. They need to pay back taxes. But you may have been reading these articles about how many billions of dollars they contribute to the Social Security system under fake IDs. They also are signing up voluntarily to file income tax because they hope that helps them if eventually they're given a chance to have a legal status. They have to wait in line. We want them to learn English. But at the end of that process, I would say 10 to 15 years, if they stay out of trouble, if they are a good employee, stay employed, I think they should be eligible for a legal status. And we should do all of that at the same time, because one without the other will not work. Should we let Martin ask the last question?
Always let Martin ask the last question.
Former Congressman.
Hillary, first of all, great remarks.
Thank you.
And I want to ask, I think, a question on everybody's mind. What do you think are the chances that the Democratic Congress, both the House and the Senate, can force this president to honor the wishes of the American people as expressed in the last election and disengage from Iraq?
Well, Martin, you know as well as I do how difficult it will be. Today and tomorrow we will vote on the bill that is coming out of the Congress to fund our troops and to set goals for us to begin to bring them home. The President has said he will veto that, and then it will come back to us. He is a very hard person to deal with on these issues. He believes he's right. He's not inclined to listen to contrary arguments. So I think that it will be extremely challenging, if at all possible. We're going to keep trying, but at some point, we don't want Democrats being blamed for our troops not being well equipped, not having the resources they need, even though we don't want them to be there in the middle of a sectarian civil war where they frankly don't even know whose side they're supposed to be on anymore. We lost, 9 wonderful young men from the 82nd Airborne, a couple of days ago with a suicide bomber that, rammed right into their, protected outpost. And this is going to continue, and it needs to stop. And the President needs to stop it because he's the one who has the authority and the power. But what I fear is that he will not, which I think is the height of irresponsibility, and that we will still be in Iraq in large numbers when he leaves office. And what I have said is that if President Bush does not extricate us from Iraq when I am president, I will. And that's what I think we have to point to. Thank you all very much.
Senator Hillary, as you know, this has been our first Washington conference. A year from now, when you are the nominee of our party, I want to invite you back to join us so we can motivate all of our NJDC people to get out there and ensure that you're the next president of the United States.
Thank you.